The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Welcome back to the Retro Rangers podcast. I am your host, George Grimm, and I'm here this evening with my two good friends, Marc Weissman and Steve Choppy. And we are going to share our memories of Ranger playoff series, both good and bad. Okay, welcome to the show, gentlemen. Thanks for coming.
Thank you for having us, sir.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, George. Appreciate it.
Okay. Okay, now we're going to do something different this evening. We're going to break it up into two shows. We're going to start with the Emil Francis era, and we're going to end right before the 1994 Stanley Cup. And then that show will be posted on Saturday morning. And then show number two will be 1994 and on, and that show will be posted sometime this week. This is the first time I've done two shows in one night, and let's hope it goes well. Okay, now I'm going to begin because I have the oldest memory, and it's my show. So, this is the 1966-67 playoffs against Montreal. They got swept by Montreal 4-0. My father stood online on Easter Sunday morning outside the Old Garden to get us tickets for the only two home games that would be games 3 and 4. And this was the first playoff series of the Emil Francis era, the first one since 1962, and the first one in my Ranger fandom. So it was a big deal. And my father was out of town for Game 3, so I went with my grandmother. And my grandmother was a hockey fan, and I liked being with her, but she didn't like Jean Beliveau. She used, Beliveau, you're a bum. So that was one thing. And Grandma liked to have a beer between periods, and she didn't mind if her underage grandson had a couple sips now and then. So that wasn't bad either. But Game 4, my father and I were in the mezzanine, behind the mezzanine. We had a standing room in the places in the mezzanine of the Old Garden. It was a great place to see a game, but you had to stand up. And early in the overtime, Red Berenson with his white helmet broke in alone on Roky Vachon, and he beat him, but he hit the post. And a few minutes later, somebody took a shot from the blue line that Eddie Jockerman made a save on, but he lost the rebound. Big John Ferguson came in and swiped at it and missed. And on the second swipe, he scored. And that ended the game. But the thing is, this was the Old Garden, and when he scored, the Garden got quiet. You could actually hear the Montreal players on the ice celebrating, and then everybody got up and gave the Rangers a big hand because the first time they made the playoffs in such a long time, and it was quite a thrill. And I have to admit that I cried. So, but there were many tears to follow in the years following that. So. All right, I have other ones to share from that era, but I'd like to hear from you guys first. So, who has the earliest memory chronologically?
Well, I actually have one question, Joy. Was that the first time you ever cried over a loss for the Rangers?
Oh yeah, because that was my first playoff series, and
right.
Really looking back, they had no chance of winning anyway, but because they were a ranked team, and I interviewed Emil about it, and he said that he had overused some of his veterans, Bob Nevin and Donnie Marshall and Phil Goyette and Harry Howe, because he didn't have anyone else to play really, So he had to really wear those guys out. So they worked very hard during the regular season to come in fourth place, and then they faced Montreal and they lost 4 straight. But that's part of being a Ranger fan. You got you have to go through pain before you go through.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, who's up?
Well, the only memory I have of that, I really only started the club. I don't qualify, I guess, to provide much input into this podcast up at this point for the simple reason I started following them in 1970. However, I was able to, at a time when you couldn't touch Ranger tickets, our high school got tickets for the Knicks, and I would just want to be inside Madison Square Garden. And I don't care for basketball. I'm just not a basketball fan, but I want to be inside the round building. So I went on a trip just to be in awe of that building and really had a great time. But the merchandise stands sold an LP, a vinyl album. It was entitled Rise of the Rangers. Yeah. And, of course, I had to buy it. And everyone on a school bus on the way back to school said, "Why did you go to the Garden and buy an album?" I said, "Well, it's not a record. It's not a music album. It's a piece, a bit on the Rangers." And so I listened to it, and early on in the record, they have an audio clip of Marv Albert, a very young Marv Albert, calling the game that you speak of, where Fergie buried the winner, and it's on there, and it kind of built it laid the groundwork for the rest of the album to flow from there, where it concentrated on that year. But that's the only thing I know about that era is that Red Barons had hit the post. That was on the album, and of course Fergie burying it. And I'm trying to use mental, get some visualizations about the old building, having seen pictures of it, and only being there myself for a circus at that time, up until that time. But
it was a great place to see a hockey game. Yeah, no, it was a really great place to see a hockey game. You were very, very close to the ice, and it was very, it had that old-time hockey atmosphere. So.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, George, not having been at the old Garden, like when they built the new one, I mean, what were some of the things you noticed as far as watching a game, or maybe how the acoustics or things like that? Was it significantly different? Do you remember being disappointed, like, oh, this is my Garden, and now they're changing, kind of like when they talked about it today?
The old Garden seats were more straight up and down, and the new Garden is more of a bowl, so you were further away from the ice. Wherever you sat, you were much further away from the ice. And as far as knocking down the old Garden, I had to go uptown a few years after they moved to the new Garden, and I guess they knocked the new Garden down. And I had to walk past where the old Garden was, and it wasn't there. Now I knew they knocked it down, but I fully expected to see it there, but it was gone, and it was sad because so many memories in that building. From all those years, my years and other people's memories, and one of the older Rangers, they brought back a lot of Rangers for the last home game in the old Garden, and one of the Rangers said, "If these walls could talk," and it's true. It would have been nice to write a book about it, but time goes on.
Did you go to the opening game, the first game of the new Garden? Were you there against Philly? No. Oh, okay.
George, you eventually had, just to digress for a quick second, you eventually got Ranger season tickets. How long into the 7th Avenue, the 31st Street Garden, did you get the seats? Was it fairly soon after the place opened?
Yeah, I got them after I graduated from high school in '69 and got myself a job, and I got 2 seats in Section 439, Row D, seats 3 and 4, and they were $3 a seat.
Wow!
So there you go.
That's amazing.
And for the playoffs, maybe $4.50. I don't know, but they were a little bit more for the playoffs, but they're $3 a seat.
Wow, that's incredible.
No surprise there.
And they only played 40 home games, I think, back then. And then those two preseason games. So it was only like $123 a seat or something like that. And
wow, that's amazing.
That's
like half the price of a ticket now.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I know. You can't even touch them. So.
Yeah. Well, like he said, I actually started in 1970 as well, although I'm not sure if I should say this, but I was 4 years old. So
whoa.
I don't remember. Sorry, guys. But I don't. What happened was my older brother, he's 6 years older. He was a goalie. He played goal, and he was a huge Eddie Jockman fan. I mean, I can remember walking into his bedroom, and they were, Ranger posters in general, but just a bunch of Eddie Jockman, the one that you probably see online all the time without a mask,
right.
Things like that. He even made his own collage. He cut clippings from Sports Illustrated or whatever and made like a Jockman collage, and he was just, and he even made he molded out of clay like a goalie, and it's got number 1. It has his last name on it, but it's got my brother's last name, but it's got number 1. It's sort of like with a cage mask and just, all different masks than Eddie had. But I remember my earliest memory is reading the Ranger yearbooks in my brother's room. And I didn't really watch hockey. I wasn't watching the games yet, but we would read, and I was 4 years old, so I was just interested about like the names, some of the names like Sheldon Cannigeezer, and we'd go in the back and look at the back roster, the all-time roster, be like Andy Atkinhead and Zelio Topazzini and all these names, and I was like, who are these people? And I remember the first hockey trivia book I ever bought. I don't remember the name of it, but I learned that the first hockey game was played in McGill University. I think it was like 1870 something. Mm-hmm. But that was like my first. Like I was actually reading about hockey a lot more before I started watching it. And then when I watched it, believe it or not, when the first thing I had to learn was icing, and I used to think that icing was when the player snow stopped. Like, when he would shave ice. And so it happened. So imagine, if Panarin's at center ice and he stops at the red line and there would be snow, I said, oh, it's icing. My brother's like, you're an idiot. What's the matter with you? And, after him saying that enough times, I realized, because the reason I did that is because back then, they had to go all the way back and touch the puck to make icing. And whenever they do that, they would spray ice. So I wasn't realizing they were doing it because it was going over the goal line. I was thinking, oh, it's because he stopped. So I just associated that with, everything else that, all the other players were doing. But, eventually I caught on. So.
Yeah. I don't know if I would even bet against that being a slight possibility that might have had something to do with it back in the day. Every time I heard of icing, it made me hungry because I was thinking about dessert. So.
Exactly.
Well, when I was a kid, the Rangers had an announcer on TV named Win Elliott, and I love the guy. He was great. But he explained that the game of hockey was first played by the Indians using horse turds and bent wood branches from trees, and it was called hockey because when the players would get hit with the puck, they would holler at hoagie, which means it hurt in Indian. Yeah. So that's I don't know if it's true now, but Wynn used to be able to tell good tales, but that's part of the background of
sure that exact story.
My background anyway.
That was in the trivia book that I bought. It was the whole hoagie derivation, and that's where it came from. So you're right. I mean, I've read that in a couple different sources. That's where it sort of started or came from.
All right. Let's credit one for Win Elliott. Actually, I go back to Gilles Villemure before he wore his mask. When the Rangers had Jacques Plante, he missed about 5 games in a row, and they called up Gilles Villemure from Buffalo, I guess, and he didn't have his mask on. He didn't have that smiling mask that we all know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That was a long time ago. So, all right. So what else is going on with you guys? What other memories do you have?
Marc, if you'd like, please go ahead.
Anybody?
Well, I was on the 1917. That's when I started following hockey. I was in the 7th grade, and the kids would be playing street hockey, ball hockey during recess or lunchtime at school, and I thought, well, that was kind of cool. I had no idea anything about hockey. I was a football fan at the time, and they were a young sports fan in general. They're knocking the ball around. I think, oh, it's kind of interesting. You know, they were talking to me a little bit, a couple of guys, a couple of girls that were fans. They said, oh, yeah, we like the Rangers, the New York Rangers. And they were telling me how exciting the game sounded. You couldn't see them at that. You couldn't view them on television at the time. There was no cable or anything of that nature, or at least not how we know it today. And I recall, I have to listen to, I believe it was NBC at the time. Listen to 66 NBC. Marv Albert is the sportscaster, the broadcaster, and he calls the games, and they're pretty fun, and they're Sunday and Wednesday nights. So I started doing it. Sounded more and more exciting. I remember tuning into a Flyer Ranger game at the time, and I think this is right around the time when the Flyers were starting to. I guess very right around that time. They were figuring out the benefits of pushing the envelope during hockey games in terms of rambunctious and violent, overly violent play. So I'm listening to the game, and there's a fight, and I've got this young, imaginative mind. I don't know what Madison Square Garden looks like. I think I do. You start putting together mental images, and the crowd is going absolutely out of control bonkers. And it's really loud on my radio, and I'm listening to my bedroom with the transistor radio and the whole 9 yards there. Yeah. And he's talking about all these different fights on the ice, and I actually panicked in my bedroom thinking, are they going to spin? All right, you have to give me a young man's break on this one. I'm envisioning them, are they going to, is there a riot in New York? Are they going to pour? I'm envisioning them pouring out of the garden. I don't know why. Pouring out of the garden like street fights and the whole 9 yards there. And it was kind of crazy. I had no idea what this is. It seemed so out of control. Of course, it drove my interest even more, and it kind of followed things off by then. And then after 1970, things started to cook up a little bit. We come to the 72 finals, my first Ranger playoff and my first Ranger playoff disappointment, making it all the way to the last round against the Bruins. And I was very happy to see, I think it was CBS in New York, Channel 2, I believe. But I was like Friday night game. It was the final game, and it was aired on regular, TV. And first of all, I'm happy as hell that I'm actually getting to watch the Rangers playing in Madison Square Garden. And then I got to watch Bobby Orr, and he crushed my spirits, that's for sure. I realized what a great player he was, but I didn't care how great he was. He was putting my Rangers putting my Rangers down, and that was going to be it. But I remember the game very clearly. I remember his spinorama slap shot goal that kind of put the icing on the cake. The last game was a shutout. I believe it was 3-0. But that was my first one, and I spent that Friday night, ruined my weekend back then. And yes, I did cry.
Yeah. Well, if you talk about the 70s, in 1971, the Rangers played the Maple Leafs. And that was when Vic Hadfield threw Bernie Perron's mask into the crowd. I was at that game. And Hadfield and Harrison, this was late in the third period, the Rangers were losing. Hadfield and Harrison went into the corner, and they were fighting. And the Perron came out of his crease to help out because everybody was pairing off. And so Eddie Jockerman comes steaming down from his end of the ice, throwing off his gloves and his mask and everything, and he slams into Perron. And somehow in the melee, Hatfield flipped his mask into the crowd, and he didn't get it back. I mean, King Clancy and the Garden cops were all over that area down on the left side of the net on the 8th Avenue end, and they didn't get it, and it was passed all around the Garden, and the fans were clapping, "Keep the mask, keep the mask," and they did. And so since Bernie didn't have his mask, he couldn't go back in. So they put Jacques Plante in for the Maple Leafs. And the next face-off, they went at it again. Teddy Irvin went into the corner with somebody, and they started fighting again. So once again, Plante left his crease, and he got involved, and Eddie came steaming down like the Lone Ranger, throwing off his glove and his stick, and slammed into Plante, and he had him in a headlock. And finally, order was restored. And then the next series was against Chicago, and that's when Pete Stemkowski scored his triple overtime goal. So that was a good playoff year. We lost, but it was very, very exciting. That was a very memorable year. So, and like you said, 72. Well, it happens. You know, the one thing that was probably bad for the Bruins was that they won the cup in Madison Square Garden. So, and it was bad for Ranger fans too because we had to see it. But, you know, life goes on. So what else, gentlemen?
Well, I have a question for you, George. When Hatfield threw the mask in the stands, the game was still going on, so were there any repercussions? Did he get a penalty or thrown out of the game or anything for doing that?
He got a penalty for the fight. And after the game, I had all the numbers in my book. We did everything but win, but both teams got fined a lot of money for those days, and Hatfield got fined, and all the players who were fighting were fined, and they didn't get suspended or anything, but you know, they had penalties called against them, and yeah, it was one of those things where you just think about it and say, wow, that actually happened, and the actual mask was returned to the Rangers a few days later. I had asked John Halligan about it once, and he said it came in a plain envelope with no return address, and it was returned, but no one knows where it was or where it came from. So
wow, that's incredible. That's great.
So Bernie got his mask back. Actually, Bernie played the next game because Jacques Plante owned the company that made the mask, so they did a quick order to get Bernie a new mask, and that's
pretty amazing when you think about them having Plante and Perron as your goalie, like Plante being a backup. I mean, that's just amazing when you really think about that.
Yeah.
So, I guess the only thing, I don't have that many specific memories from the early 70s. I went to my first game. Besides my brother getting me into hockey, my uncle had, I guess, what you would call partial season tickets in the orange section. They used to play consistently. They would always play Sunday and Wednesday nights at MSG, and he got all the Sunday home games. And so he took me to a game, 1975, I think, against the Kansas City Scouts, if you remember that, who of course became our current enemy right now. But all I remember from the game is JD was in net, and we won 5-1. Like we had just Davidson had just gotten here. It was after the Jockman waiver and all that, and he had gotten his.
Yeah. Wow.
That's a pretty decent uniform. One of my favorite historically. One of my favorite uniforms in terms of colors and designs. I always liked them. For whatever that's worth, I think that's what they brought to my young eyes at the time, and plus it was some nice fodder for the Rangers to chew up every couple of games. I always liked when they played the week or two. I loved when they went out west back then, you're always coming home with 2 or 3 victors in your pocket. L.A. was no problem. Vancouver was certainly no problem. And the Oakland or California Golden Seals, whichever,
right,
were also not a problem. So I think they had a good time back in those days going out to the West Coast.
Yeah.
And I remember that's about when I started watching, Jim Gordon, Bill Chadwick on Channel 9.
Right,
they went out, and when they went out west, it was about 10:30 at night when the game would start. And, that's when I started, having the TV on, and, I was supposed to be going to bed, and my parents would come up, and I'd quickly shut off the television, and I was sleeping, and then, or if they weren't on, and for the home games, I would kind of do the same thing. I'd have a transistor radio under my pillow, listen to Marvin Sal, on home games, and although sometimes I remember there were certain games where Jim Gordon and Bill Chadwick actually were on radio, and it was really interesting to hear them be much more descriptive. When you're calling a game on TV, it's almost you don't want to be too descriptive because everybody can see what's going on. It's kind of it's like overly describing what's going on. But when all of a sudden, like Jim Gordon's he's talking like a mile a minute, like he's telling you everything that's going on and where the puck is and which line it's crossing and all that. And I was like, oh, that's really, I never thought about that. You can't. It's not just calling the same game. You have to call a very different game when it's radio.
Yeah. Well, the thing with Jim Gordon that's amazing, he once said that the first hockey game he ever called was the first hockey game he ever saw. So
wow.
That's amazing, So that's skill. That's real skill. How about the 78-79 playoffs, Marc? You said that was the first time you cried.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Exactly. Well, I remember that was back, the first round was get best of 3, if you can believe that. I remember that. We played L.A., I believe. We beat L.A., I think 2-1, and then we beat Philly. And then, of course, there was the classic Islander series, 1979. And while, most people remember or they've seen on YouTube, the Game 6 highlights with Greshner getting the series-winning goal and all that. Yeah. 2 games earlier, in Game 4, was the game where it went into overtime. And the night before the game, I'm not sure how old I was at that point, but I didn't have a jersey, so I took a plain white T-shirt and a magic marker. And by then, JD was standing on his head and leading us, at every game. So I did New York across the front and Rangers diagonally, so it looked, kind of like the logo on the front of the T-shirt. And on the back, I wrote Davidson across the top and number 30. And I was like, oh, he's our guy. Blah, blah. Now, here's the thing. Back then, I don't even know if there was MSG cable. I guess there had to be. But they were playing the Islanders, and even though they were on MSG for home games, they were on Sports Channel for away games. Now, my uncle who I told you, my uncle, had season tickets. He had a friend who was an Islander fan who had Sports Channel. So here I was, teenager at this point. I got to go to my uncle's friend to watch the Rangers play away, at the Coliseum. So that was hard. And so I think it was Game 4, and it was tied, and the puck, kind of came down from the Islander zone into the Ranger zone and went just over the blue line. And it was one of those plays where JD was wondering, well, should I stay here and kind of sit back, or should I try to come out and maybe beat one of the Islanders to the puck? So he comes flying out of the net, and at the same time, Bobby Nystrom's coming over the line, and they collide about the top of the circle, I guess it was. And it looked like, this amazing play, but as they crashed into each other, the puck went all the way up in the air, came down, landed about 2 feet in front of the crease, and there was Nystrom, and he just tapped it in the open net for the overtime winner. And I was just so upset, and I just remember, being furious, and I got home, and I took off my T-shirt, and I'm, crumpling it up, and I threw it on the bed, and I fell on the bed, and I was, bawled my eyes out. I was like, oh, my God, I can't believe. I was so, thinking this was definitely going to happen, and we were going to, luckily we ended up winning the series, obviously, but that game was so demoralizing for me, and it's definitely the first time I ever got that upset over a game.
Yeah, well, the lasting picture that I have in my mind from that series was there was a picture of a Pot fan sitting on the sill of the bench, leaning against the door, looking very dejected. And that's my lasting impression of that.
Yeah, JD talks about that a lot. Whenever he talks about that series, and how it was basically a learning experience for the Islanders, because then they went on that run after that. He said, but they were just dejected, and there was Potvin leaning against the boards in front of the bench. You're right.
Yeah. And then they went up and they won the first game against Montreal, and Espo wanted to take the team out of Montreal because because he knew all the young players would be distracted by being in Montreal, but Shiro wanted to stay, and then they lost the next 4 games straight. So
yep, I remember that too. We won 4-1, and everybody was all excited, and then we were actually up 2-0 in game 2, and I was up in my parents' bedroom watching the game, and my brother was actually outside playing hockey in the street with his friends. And I opened the window up, and I'm like, it's 1-0, we're winning. And then a couple minutes later, it's 2-0, we're winning. And then all of a sudden I'm like, it's 2-1, it's 2-2, it's 3-2. Like all of a sudden that Montreal just kept scoring. And I'm sure you heard the story. Bundy Rock was supposed to play that game, and he got hurt in the pregame warm-up. Yeah, so then because they were going to not start because Dryden had lost game 1, he wasn't going to play game 2. And then he ends up playing, and of course that was it.
Yeah. He stoned him.
Yeah,
so,
yeah.
That's and then we got Craig Patrick and Herb Brooks, and with anytime the Rangers lost after a while, it was like old hat. It was like it was what was supposed to happen. It was more accepted every year that this was just what it was going to be. They just weren't going to win, So.
Yeah, you're right. They were never the favorites, certainly.
No.
And of course, and then they played the Islanders pretty much every spring in the early '80s.
For those 4 years, yeah.
Yeah, it's. I remember actually. I don't know if you saw last night. The answer to the trivia question was Joe Micheletti had some record of most point assists per game in the playoffs or something like that. I remember Joe. The only memory I have of him playing when he played for St. Louis, we played St. Louis in 1981 in the playoffs.
Right.
And I remember that series. We did pretty well. And my biggest memory from that is it was the first time I ever recorded highlights, or I should say recorded games while they were being played. I put a cassette tape, a regular audio cassette tape, in my radio, and I was recording, Marv Albert with all the calls. Wow. And when the season was over the summer, because I pretty much, hockey's pretty much my only sport that I either play or follow, and so in the summertime, I wanted to keep playing hockey, and my friends were playing baseball or basketball, so I was like, well, I'm just going to go play. So it was like 80 degrees out and humid, and I would put on my roller skates, and I would go out in front of my house, I had a boom box that I would put behind the goal. And it was just a bunch of highlights of Marv calling, Barry Beck goals or, whoever, just over and over from that series, from the 81 series. And I would kind of skate back and forth and try to, time my shots when he said, Ranger goal kind of thing. Yeah, so that's my memory of that,
That was very creative and imaginative. I like that. I thought I did imaginative things. I think you just won.
Well, it's actually going to get a little worse, I think, as we go on. But but yeah, I remember that's kind of where I guess it was borderline obsession at that point in the early '80s for me. But you mentioned Herb Brooks. That was my first playoff game. I got a kind of a story with this. Like we were talking before, how whenever the Rangers went out in the West Coast, it was late night game like it is now, 10:30, 11 o'clock. Well, there were 2 games it was like February, and they played LA and then they played Vancouver. And during those two games, and only those two games, WOR Channel 9 advertised that there was a Ranger playoff ticket lottery. And normally I wouldn't even think about entering, but I'm like, how many people are up at this hour? I would think if there's any chance of doing it. So I sent in a bunch of postcards. I actually sent in 12 postcards because Donnie Maloney was my favorite Ranger at that time. And I remember that. And, a couple of weeks went by, I didn't hear anything. All of a sudden, with a week to go in the regular season, I get this envelope that, has a Ranger return address label. I'm like, oh, my God, what is this? So I open it up, and it basically says, you've won the lottery. You've won the right to buy these tickets. And I was like, and I was in high school at this point. I really didn't have very much money.
Sure.
So I'm like, and believe it, you were talking about $3 tickets. These were playoff tickets. They were $12 for blue season.
Yeah.
But here's the problem. At least the problem for me was you had to buy 2 rounds worth of tickets up front.
Yeah.
Fact, so it was best of 5, the first round, and best of 7. So and then for the home games. So there was like you had to basically buy 5 home games, which at 2 seats, $12, it turned out to be like $120.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I don't have $120. So I had it on my desk in my room for a couple of days, and literally by like a few days went by, I gave up. I didn't even tell anybody, and I threw it in my I had a Ranger garbage can, okay, and I threw it in my Ranger garbage can, and I was like, oh well. And that night, my uncle came over for dinner, and I told him, I said, I could have gotten playoff tickets, and he's like, what? Because I guess by then I think he had stopped going to games, at least season ticket wise. And he's like, what do you mean you could have had? He's like freaking out. And I'm like, what? They said, go get the letter. So I take the letter like out of my garbage. And to this day, he teases me. He's like, in the garbage. like I saved you. And we started talking. And my mother heard us talking, my brother. So all of a sudden, everybody was like chipping in. It was like a GoFundMe to go to the Rangers. And, I could afford like $25, but that was it. But he chipped in, and we went to the clinching game against Philly. That the first round, they were up 2-0, with the potential to. They both won both games in Philly, and they were coming back to the Garden for Game 3. And it was just the first round, and it was the most amazing. They won 9-3. I think Robbie McClanahan had like 2 goals, and we were up. We're up in the Blues. People were jumping so high, they were literally putting their fist through the styrofoam ceiling. Like it was like snowing in our section because people just kept jumping up and down, and I'm like, this is unbelievable. And then even better, we get out of the game, and we're right on 7th Avenue, by the entrance to Penn Station, and it was like bedlam. And I remember looking around like, this is only the first round. Like, what is this going to be like if we ever win the Stanley Cup? Because it was only the first round, and my parents were actually having dinner in Chinatown, and they knew when the game was over because people were setting off fireworks in Chinatown. And because they were supposed to come pick us up, they were going to drive us home. So we get there, we're in the car. I finally get in my parents' car. We're like stuck in traffic right at the light, by, 32nd Street. And people are car surfing. People are jumping across. Sorry, my dog. People are going across the hoods of cars, and I'm reaching out the window of the car, like shaking hands with cabbies. I don't even know. It was like unbelievable, and I'm thinking, this is crazy. And it was just partially because it was Philly, of course, that helped. But just the sweep, and it was like, we're gonna do it, and I just like, man, I kept thinking, man, I don't know what this city's gonna be like, when we win, but this is just amazing. So that was my first playoff experience.
That's good.
That was really
Thanks. The only other thing I'd add, when I first got to the Garden, we came out of the subway, some guy offered me $300 for one of my tickets, and I literally just looked at him and said, you're absolutely not. See you later. I was like, it's my first playoff game, I'm definitely going, but I remember getting offered. That was the first time a scalper ever approached me as opposed to the other way around.
Yeah, right? You had him and he didn't. Yep. All right, let's close up show number 1 now and move on to 1994. Okay, so we can get all our 94 memories in there. So let me stop and restart, and we'll be back. This has been part 1 of 2 shows, and I will Hold on.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices, and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.